The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in March, and Della Voss set it on the kitchen table without opening it. She stood at the window instead, watching the last of the February mud harden along the fence line, her coffee going cold in her hand. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, with a green logo printed in the upper left corner that she recognized without reading it. She had been expecting something like this. What she had not expected was how ordinary it would feel, how the arrival of a thing you have dreaded for 2 years could land so quietly on a pine table beside a jar of last summer's sourwood honey and a broken halter buckle waiting to be repaired. She picked up her coffee. She did not pick up the envelope. That envelope would sit on that table for 11 days. And what happened because she left it there, because she never signed the single page folded inside it, would take 4 years to become a story anyone thought worth telling. But by the time the telling came, even the land would seem different. Even the old Blue Clarage corn, threaded through with dark gold silk, would seem like it had been waiting for exactly this. Her name was Della Voss. She farmed 83 acres in Grainger County, Tennessee, in the long ridge and hollow country east of Rutledge where the soil runs red-brown over limestone and the mornings in October smell like wood smoke before anyone has lit a fire. She had been farming that land for 11 years, ever since her father Lloyd Voss left it to her in a will that surprised almost everyone in the county except Della herself. Lloyd's older brother had farmed the next ridge over for 40 years. Lloyd's 2 male cousins had both assumed, in that comfortable unexamined way of assuming, that land passes to men. The will was read on a Thursday in September. By Sunday, the cousins had stopped returning phone calls. Della was 31 years old when she took the farm. She had no husband, no business partner, no hired hand beyond a retired schoolteacher named Purvis Goad who came 2 mornings a week to help with the heavy work and who asked no questions and held no opinions about how she chose to manage the ground. She had a 1987 Ford tractor with a cracked left headlight, a wooden barn her grandfather had raised in 1952, and 11 seasons of notes, every one of them in her own hand, in the same green ledger book her father had used before her, recording soil temperatures, planting dates, yield weights, rainfall accumulations, and the behavior of insects she had no names for yet. She also had, in a tobacco tin on the second shelf of the mudroom, a collection of corn seed that most people in Grainger County had not seen since the 1970s. The Blue Clarage was one of them. An open-pollinated dent corn, pre-hybrid, with kernels that ran from deep gold to near amber at full dent, and cobs that averaged 9 to 11 inches on Della's ground. Her father had saved it. His father before him had saved it. There were stories, she could not verify them, that the strain had been in the Voss family since before the First World War, possibly longer. What she knew for certain was that it grew on her ridgeline the way it seemed to understand the shape of the soil there, leaning into the prevailing southwest wind rather than straining against it, holding its ears high even in a dry August. She also grew Bloody Butcher, an old red dent variety, dark as dried roses at harvest. She grew Pencil Cob, a white flour corn her grandmother had called breadmaker. She grew Tennessee Red Cob, which her father had insisted was not sentimental preservation but simply the best corn for the holler ground where the drainage was slow. And she grew a small planting of Stoll's evergreen sweet corn along the south-facing garden plot, just for the table, just for the brief and irreplaceable window of late July when you could walk out at dusk and eat an ear standing up, with no ceremony at all. None of these were registered with any seed company. None of them had been touched by a laboratory. They had been maintained through 11 of Della's seasons and perhaps 70 years of family seasons before that by the simplest possible method, choosing the best ears, letting them dry completely on the stalk before harvest, shelling them into glass jars in November, and storing those jars in a root cellar that stayed a reliable 52 degrees year-round. This was the thing the Monsanto representative, a young man named Brent Calloway who drove a clean silver pickup and wore boots that had never seen a fence post, did not understand when he sat at Della's pine table in April 2 years before that cream envelope arrived. Brent Calloway had driven up Della's gravel lane on a warm April morning, and she had offered him coffee because that was how she had been raised. He sat in the chair near the window, the one that caught the morning light, and he spread a set of printed materials across the table with the practiced ease of a man who had done this in many kitchens across many counties. He was not unkind. He was, in fact, genuinely trying to help her, in the way that someone can try to help you while understanding almost nothing about what you actually need. The contract was straightforward, he said. The seed was Roundup Ready field corn, he said. The yield improvement over her current variety was, on average, between 18 and 22%, he said. She would not have to worry about weeds the way she currently worried about weeds. She would not have to save seed. She would not have to spend November in a root cellar with a lamp and a shelling peg working through jar after jar of open-pollinated corn that the market, he said, and here he paused with the particular gentleness of a man choosing words carefully, the market really doesn't support the way it used to. Della listened to all of it. She held her coffee with both hands. She looked out the window at the ridgeline where the Blue Clarage would go in the ground in 6 weeks. Then she told him she would think about it. He left the materials. He drove back down the gravel lane. And Della sat with the papers for a long time before she stacked them neatly, set them on the shelf above the mudroom sink, and went out to check the soil thermometer she had pressed into the red dirt of the ridgeline plot. 51 degrees. 3 more weeks, probably. She did not call Brent Calloway back. She planted her Blue Clarage in mid-May, as she always had, in rows spaced to her father's measurement, the width of a man's arm span plus 4 inches, which Lloyd Voss had told her was the distance the old-timers had always used and which Della had never found reason to dispute. She cultivated between rows with the Ford tractor, going slowly enough that she could watch the soil turn. She pulled broadleaf weeds by hand along the close rows nearest the fence. In July, when the silk came and the ears began to fill, she walked the rows at dusk the way her father had, checking ear set and husk coverage and the way the plants were holding their leaves in the heat. She kept notes. She always kept notes. The yield that year was not remarkable. 412 bushels from the ridgeline plot, which worked out to roughly 82 bushels per acre on the 5-acre planting, a number that would have made Brent Calloway wince, given that the hybrids he was selling were pushing toward 180, 200 bushels per acre in good ground that year. She knew what those numbers were. She was not ignorant of them. She had read the university extension reports, the seed company literature, the figures from the state agriculture office. She understood that by every conventional measure of modern American grain farming, what she was doing made no economic sense. She shelled her seed corn in November and wrote the yield in her ledger and went on. The cream envelope arrived the following March, as she had said. By then, the story had already begun moving in directions she couldn't track, quiet, below the surface, the way a spring moves underground before it ever finds a crack to come up through. The first direction was a woman named Cecilia Park. Cecilia Park ran a restaurant in Knoxville called Root Ground, 40 minutes west of Rutledge on Highway 11W, a narrow place on a side street near the Old City District with 16 tables and a chalkboard menu that changed completely every 4 days. She had been sourcing heritage vegetables from farms in Grainger and Hamblin and Claiborne counties for 3 years, working through a network of connections that was less a formal supply chain and more a series of phone numbers written in the back of a small notebook she carried everywhere. She had heard about Della Voss from a seed librarian in Rogersville who had heard about the Blue Clarage from a woman at a slow food potluck who had brought a cornbread that stopped 3 people mid-conversation. Cecilia drove up the gravel lane on a Saturday in October, a full year before the cream envelope and more than 2 years before the front page. She parked next to the barn and walked to the garden gate and called out and waited. Della came around the side of the barn in rubber boots and a canvas jacket, her hands still in work gloves, a basket of dry cobs balanced on her hip. She looked at Cecilia the way country people look at city people who show up without calling, with an assessment that takes about 4 seconds and is almost always accurate. "You called ahead," Della said. "I did." "You didn't answer." Cecilia held out her hand. "Cecilia Park. I have a restaurant in Knoxville." Della set the basket down and shook the hand. "Della Voss. I know. Your cornbread ended 3 conversations." They stood in the thin October sunlight for a moment, and then Della picked up her basket and walked toward the barn, and Cecilia followed, which was the correct thing to do, and Della noted that she understood it was the correct thing to do. Inside the barn, on a low wooden table near the east wall, Della had laid out 12 varieties of dried corn in rows, each variety in its own shallow wooden tray, each tray labeled in her handwriting on a piece of masking tape. Blue Clarage, Bloody Butcher, Pencil Cob, Hickory King, Tennessee Red Cob. 6 others. The cobs lay in their rows with the quiet authority of things that have survived longer than the people who grew them. Cecilia walked the row slowly. She did not touch anything until Della nodded once, and then she picked up a blue Clarage cob and turned it in her hands, the deep amber of the kernel base fading to gold at the crown, the slight bluish cast in the dent that gave the variety its name. "What does it taste like?" Cecilia asked. "Ground." Della thought about this for a moment with the honesty of someone who does not answer questions carelessly. "Earthy. A little sweet in a dry year. It has some weight to it. My father called it a corn you have to chew." Cecilia set the cob down with a deliberateness that meant she was already working out how to use it. "I want to serve this." "I know you do," Della said. "That's why you came." The arrangement they made that day was simple and written on no paper. Cecilia would take whatever meal corn Della could spare after seed selection, the cobs that were beautiful but not the most beautiful, the ones selected for eating rather than for carrying the variety forward. Della would price it at what she needed, not at what the commodity market suggested. Cecilia would pay within 30 days. What Della did not say, and what Cecilia did not ask, was whether this would last. Whether the farm would still be growing Blue Clarage in 3 years or 5. Whether the economics would hold. Both women understood these questions were present. Neither of them said them aloud. Della signed no contract. She grew what she had always grown. She milled a portion of the Blue Clarage herself on a small stone burr mill she had bought second-hand from a retired miller in Grainger County, keeping the grind coarse the way the old recipes required. She drove it to Knoxville herself, in the bed of her pickup, in brown paper bags sealed with masking tape and labeled in her handwriting. Root Ground began serving Blue Clarage polenta in the fall, with a sauce of dried porcini mushrooms and roasted garlic and the last of the season's cherry tomatoes from a farm in Hamblin County. Cecilia wrote on the chalkboard, "Blue Clarage dent corn, grown on the ridgeline. Grainger County. Open-pollinated." The note was not marketing language. It was information, the way all true hospitality is finally just information about where things come from and who grew them. The polenta sold out every time it appeared. But in Grainger County itself, things were different. The county extension agent that year was a man named Harold Sprouse, who had held the position for 16 years and who was, by most measures, a competent and well-meaning man who understood his job to be the delivery of current best practices from the land-grant university system to the farmers in his county. He came to Della's farm in the spring following Cecilia's first visit, on a morning in April when the Blue Clarage seed was laid out on the mudroom table for sorting. He came because he had heard she was not participating in any current crop insurance program, was not using any certified seed variety, and had declined what he understood to be a favorable contract from a major seed provider. He stood in the mudroom doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the seed on the table with an expression that was not contemptuous exactly, but adjacent to it. The expression of a man looking at something he has decided in advance to understand as a problem. "Della," he said, "you know I've got nothing against the old ways. My grandfather kept open-pollinated corn. But this is a different market. The buyers at the elevator don't want this corn. The commodity price doesn't account for variety. You're growing something with no certified yield data and no insurance protection on 83 acres in a county that had a drought 4 out of the last 7 years." Della was sorting seed as he spoke, turning each kernel in her fingers, looking for the one she would not plant, too small, too irregular, wrong shape at the crown, and setting them aside in a chipped blue bowl. Her hands did not stop while he talked. "I'm not selling to the elevator," she said. "Then where are you selling?" "Knoxville. And to a mill in Asheville that's interested in the Bloody Butcher. And to a seed library in Rogersville." Harold Sprouse put his hat back on his head with the slow motion of a man recalibrating. A seed library, he said, in the tone people use when they have heard a word they recognize but cannot quite connect to a practical purpose. For preservation. In case mine burns down. He stood there a moment longer. He was not a bad man. He told her, as he left, that he thought she was making this harder than it needed to be. She thanked him for coming. She meant it. What she did not say was what she wrote in her ledger that night, under the date of the visit, in her careful handwriting. HJS says I'm making it harder than it needs to be. Possibly true. But the harder way is the way I know. She underlined the last sentence once. Then she closed the ledger and went to check on the Tamworth gilt who was due to farrow in the morning. The sow, a deep red Tamworth gilt named Pearl, one of 3 Tamworth sows Della kept on the farm's eastern pasture, delivered 7 piglets before dawn, in the middle of a cold April rain, and Della was there for all of it, kneeling in the straw with a headlamp and a towel, drying each one, watching for breathing, making sure Pearl was calm and not overlying. By 5 in the morning she had 7 living piglets and mud on both knees and the feeling that comes only from being present at the beginning of something, a feeling that has no adequate word in English but that farmers in Ridge and Hollow country would simply call being there. She walked back to the house in the gray light. The cream-colored envelope was still on the table. She had not looked at it in 3 days. She picked it up now, in her mud-dampened hands, and finally slid a thumb under the flap. The letter inside was a single page, polite and measured in language that had been written by lawyers but signed by a regional sales representative she had never met. It said that the window for the current contract season was closing. It said that the pricing structure would not be available after April 30th. It said that she was welcome to call with questions. It was not threatening. It was simply final in the way that all doors are final once they close. Della read it twice. She folded it back along its original crease. She set it on the table. Then she got a glass of water and sat down in the chair by the window, the one that caught the morning light, and watched the sky go from gray to the particular pale gold of a Tennessee April dawn, and she made the decision that had, if she was honest with herself, already been made for 2 years. She was not going to sign. And the moment of that decision felt nothing like courage. That was the thing no one would tell it right, later, when people tried to explain what she had done. Courage implies a contest with fear, and what Della felt sitting in that chair in the April dawn was less courage than certainty, the quiet, bone-deep certainty of a person who has been paying attention to the same ground for 11 years and knows, in the way that attention finally becomes knowledge, exactly what lives there. She took the letter to the mudroom. She set it in the wooden box where she kept documents that needed to be filed. She went back to the barn to check on Pearl and the 7 Tamworth piglets, who were nursing with the vigorous, unambiguous purpose of new animals in the world. That summer the Blue Clarage grew as it always had, leaning into the southwest wind, holding its ears high, threading the rows with its dark gold silk through the first week of July. Della walked the rows at dusk. She kept her notes. The humidity came in hard in August and she watched the rows carefully for silk mold, found a half-dozen cobs with early infection and pulled them, documented the location, adjusted her note for the following year. Cecilia Park drove up the gravel lane in October with a check and a bottle of cider vinegar she had made herself, which was not part of any arrangement but was simply the gesture of a woman who understood that the people who grew things for her were not vendors but something harder to name. They sat on the back porch in the last warm evening of the year and talked about what was happening in the world, the consolidation in seed markets, the rural hospitals closing, the way the conversation about food in cities was changing shape, and they did not resolve any of it, but the talking itself felt like something. Cecilia said, at the end of the evening, standing by her car with the dark coming in from the ridge, I want to write something about this. About you and the corn. For a friend who has a magazine. Della looked at the ridgeline, where the spent stalks were still standing in the dark, pale as old bone. What would you say? What I know, Cecilia said. What the corn tastes like. How long it's been here. What it means that you kept it. Della thought about this. I didn't keep it to be a story, she said. I know, Cecilia said. That's what makes it one. The article appeared in the spring, a long piece in a regional food magazine called The Appellation Table, with a photograph Cecilia had taken herself on her phone of a single Blue Clarage cob lying in a wooden tray, the amber gold kernels catching the afternoon light from the barn's east window. The piece was careful and specific. It named the variety and its history. It named Della's father and the tobacco tin and the root cellar. It talked about the polenta at Root Ground and the seed library in Rogersville and the Asheville Mill. It mentioned, without drama, that Della had declined a contract with a major seed company in favor of maintaining her open-pollinated varieties. The piece ran in March. By April, Della had received 47 emails and letters from people she did not know. A seed library in Vermont asked for a small quantity of Blue Clarage for their collection. A food historian at the University of Georgia sent a formal inquiry about the variety's documented history. A farming family in Giles County called to ask if they could come see the operation. 3 of Lloyd Voss's old farming neighbors stopped by without calling. They stood in the mudroom, one at a time, turning their hats in their hands, and told her that her father would have been proud. Della thanked each one. She meant it. She also went back to her ledger after the last one left and sat for a long time without writing anything. The thing she was afraid of was this, that all this attention, all this arrival of interest and strangers and the particular pressure of people deciding you mean something, would change the work itself. That the corn would become a symbol before it finished being a crop. She had seen this happen to other things, to places, to practices, to people, and she had watched the symbol replace the substance like a photograph replacing a memory, brighter and flatter and less true. She wrote in the ledger, "The corn is not a story yet. It is seed in a jar." She underlined it twice. But the world had its own momentum now. In May of that year, 2 years after the cream envelope, 1 month after the Appellation Table piece, a woman arrived at the farm whom Della had not expected and had not invited. She was older, perhaps 70, with white hair cut short and a canvas field bag over one shoulder, and she climbed out of a mud-spattered Subaru and walked to the gate and called out with the calm authority of someone accustomed to arriving in new places. Her name was Dr. Ruth Hensley. She was a plant geneticist, retired from the University of Tennessee, who had spent 30 years studying the genetic diversity of traditional Appalachian crop varieties and who had, in retirement, returned to what she called the original work, the physical, seasonal, unglamorous labor of finding, documenting, and preserving the strains that the commodity system had not had the opportunity to erase. She had read the article. She had looked up Della's family name in 3 archives. She had driven from Knoxville on a Tuesday morning with a field notebook and a question she had been carrying for longer than the drive. She stood at the gate with her notebook and said, "I want to ask you about the Blue Clarage. But first I want to ask you something harder. How many years of continuous selection do you have documentation for?" Della opened the gate. "Come to the root cellar," she said. They went down the short flight of stone steps into the 52-degree dark, Della pulling the cord for the single bare bulb, the shelves of glass jars coming into the light around them, 11 years of her own seed, and the older jars from her father's time, some of them sealed with wax, some with rubber rings, each one labeled in the handwriting of whoever had put them up. Lloyd Voss, 1989. Lloyd Voss, 1983. A jar in older handwriting, fainter, that read simply BC, 1971, and bore no other name. Ruth Hensley stood very still in the root cellar. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She looked at the shelves the way a person looks at something they have spent their professional life searching for and had half decided did not exist anymore. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, and her voice had the quietness of someone working hard to stay in the academic register and not the personal one. "It's seed," Della said. "It's a documented lineage," Ruth said. "A continuous, unbroken genetic record of a pre-hybrid dent corn variety maintained through at least 5 decades of on-farm selection in consistent soil conditions." She turned from the shelves. In the bare bulb light she looked like she might say something else, and then she did not, and she turned back to the jars. My father used to say, Della said, after a while, that a seed jar knows more about a piece of ground than any soil test. Ruth Hensley wrote that down in her notebook, in the root cellar, in the cold, and Della watched her write it and did not say anything more. What came next moved faster than Della had expected, and slower than the world around her seemed to want. Ruth Hensley submitted a formal seed collection request to the USDA National Plant Germplasm System on behalf of the University of Tennessee. A small grant was written to fund a genetic analysis of the Blue Clarage against historical samples in the National Center for Plant Health and Aging's database in Fort Collins, Colorado. The analysis would take 8 months. Della signed the paperwork for the germplasm donation with her usual care, reading every clause, asking 2 questions, making 1 amendment. She kept her own seed, as she always had. The donation was a copy, not the original. The original stayed in the root cellar at 52 degrees. That fall she harvested the Blue Clarage and the Bloody Butcher and the Pencil Cob and wrote the yields in her ledger. Blue Clarage, 468 bushels, ridgeline plot. Up from 412 the previous year. She had made a small adjustment to planting density based on 3 years of notes, and the adjustment had held. She wrote a single word in the margin, good. She drove 200 pounds of ground Blue Clarage meal to Cecilia in Knoxville, 100 pounds of Bloody Butcher flour to the mill in Asheville, and a set of carefully selected seed samples to the library in Rogersville. She sold the remaining cobs, the ones not saved, not milled, to 3 new accounts, a bakery in Johnson City, a restaurant in Greenville, and a small grocery in Morristown that had started a section of local heritage grains. The math that year, for the first time, was not embarrassing. She did not share the ledger with anyone. But she noted, in her careful handwriting, that the farm's income from the heritage varieties had grown by approximately 31% over the previous year, that this growth had come entirely from the direct and near-direct market relationships she had built without a broker or a commodity index, and that she could now see a path. She did not write the word sustainable, because she had always hated its overuse, but she meant something like it. She could see a path forward that required no one else's permission. Harold Sprouse drove up the lane in November, as he did most Novembers, to talk about the following year's crop plans and whether Della needed any assistance from the county office. He stood in the mudroom with his hat in his hands again, in the same posture as before, but something in him had shifted, some small repositioning of assumptions that he would never name directly but that showed in the way he looked at the seed jars on the shelf. I heard about the university project, he said. Did you? The germplasm thing. He turned his hat once. I also heard about the Asheville mill. And the Knoxville restaurant. He paused. Cecilia Park's place is hard to get into, I hear. Della was checking the water temperature in the pressure canner, not looking at him. You want coffee, Harold? I wouldn't say no. They sat at the pine table in the kitchen, the same table where Brent Calloway's printed materials had been spread 3 years before. Harold Sprouse held his coffee with both hands and looked out the window at the ridgeline. I should have listened more, he said. 3 years ago. Della looked at him. She did not make it easy or hard. You were doing your job, she said. Your job told you one thing. My land told me something else. He nodded slowly. The extension office has been getting calls, he said. From other counties. People asking about heritage corn programs. About preservation seed saving. He looked down at his coffee. They're asking because of you. Della set her cup down and was quiet for a moment. Through the window the November ridgeline was bare-stalked and brown, the old corn standing in its patient rows waiting to be cleared. Tell them to keep notes, she said finally. That's all. Keep notes from the beginning. He nodded once more and finished his coffee and left without staying for the second cup he usually took. And Della sat at the table for a long time after he was gone, watching the ridgeline and thinking about what she had told him, which was also the truest summary she knew how to give of everything she had done. Keep notes from the beginning. The genetic analysis came back in February, 2.5 years after the cream envelope. Ruth Hensley called on a Thursday afternoon, and her voice, over the phone, had the particular quality of controlled excitement that scientists learn to maintain over decades of professional disappointment and eventual vindication. She spoke for 4 minutes. Della stood in the mudroom holding the phone and looking at the wall and listening. The Blue Clarage from Della's root cellar was not just an old variety. The genetic sequence, compared against historic samples in the Fort Collins database and against 3 other Blue Clarage samples collected from different sources, showed a level of allelic diversity that the analysis team described as exceptional, evidence of decades of on-farm selection in a specific microclimate that had, over time, produced a genetically distinct population. Not simply the Blue Clarage of the catalog. A Blue Clarage shaped by this ridgeline, this soil, this particular red-brown limestone country east of Rutledge, in the hands of this family. Ruth said the phrase that Della would think about for a long time afterward: the corn carries the history of your ground. Della did not say anything for a moment. The mudroom smelled of rubber boots and last year's dried sage hanging from the rafter. Pearl's piglets, now full-grown Tamworths on the eastern pasture, were moving in the distance, their sounds just audible through the wall. What does the analysis do for the seed? Della asked. It establishes provenance, Ruth said. Scientific documentation of the lineage. For the germplasm record. And for the market. I'm not changing how I grow it, Della said. No one is asking you to. I want to say that plainly. I know you do, Ruth said. And it's already plain. The paper was published in May in the Journal of Ethnobiology and Ethnomedicine, a dry title for a document that was, at its core, about a woman who had refused to be rushed and a grain that had been growing in the same ridge and hollow country for longer than anyone alive could personally remember. The paper named Della Voss as the primary conservationist. It documented the root cellar, the selection practices, the lineage of jars going back to 1971. It reproduced, with permission, 3 lines from her green ledger, the ones her father had written, in September of 1989, about the behavior of the Blue Clarage in a drought year. Cecilia Park read the paper on the day it published. She called Della that evening. The Tennessean wants to run a piece, she said. Della was at the kitchen table with the ledger open. The newspaper? Sunday magazine section. A long feature. Della looked out the window. The ridgeline was deep green now, the Blue Clarage 6 weeks in the ground and pushing through the red soil in its strong, reliable rows. What would they say? What you've done, Cecilia said. The corn. The root cellar. The university paper. And the contract you turned down. There was a brief pause. Brent Calloway, from the seed company, I'm told he's been called for comment already. Della set her pen down. What did he say? That they respect her decision, Cecilia said, in a tone that indicated these were not her own words. Della looked at the ridgeline for a long time. The evening light was coming in low and golden through the window, the same light that had been coming through that window every May evening for 11 of her years, and for how many years before her she could not count. The light that fell on her father's chair and her grandmother's mason jars and the hook where Lloyd Voss had hung his barn coat every evening when he came in from the fields. Tell them they can come, she said finally. But I'm going to be in the field when they arrive. They can walk out to meet me. The journalist's name was Marcus Webb, and he arrived on a Saturday morning in June when the Blue Clarage was shoulder high and the Tamworth sows were in the eastern pasture with their backs in the sun. He was a tall man in his 40s who had been writing about Tennessee food and farming for 20 years and who had the good sense, when he found Della in the ridgeline rows with her ledger under her arm and a soil probe in her hand, to simply say good morning and wait. They walked the rows. Della showed him the ear development, the way the ears were sitting high on the stalk, the silk darkening toward the tip already in the early summer heat. She showed him the difference between a plant selected well and a plant that had come from a compromised kernel, the subtle signs she read in stem thickness and leaf angle. She showed him the corner of the plot where she was trialing a small experimental planting of Pencil Cob in the ridgeline soil, a variety she had always grown on the garden ground but was curious to test at field scale. She showed him the root cellar. He photographed the shelves of jars without asking her to arrange them. She was glad of that. She showed him the green ledger. He looked at the pages with the careful attention of someone reading something written in a language he almost knows, taking in the dates and the numbers and the marginal notes, his finger tracing without touching the line where her father had written about the drought year. He did not photograph the ledger. He asked if he could transcribe 3 lines. She said yes. He asked about the contract. She told him the plain story, the April visit, the cream envelope, the March morning with Pearl's piglets and the cold light coming up over the ridge. She did not frame it as defiance. She told it the way she had lived it, as a decision that followed from everything that came before it, the way a seed follows from the soil that has been prepared for it. Marcus Webb wrote for a long time in his notebook. Then he looked up at the ridgeline, the corn standing in its rows in the June light, and he said a thing that Della thought was true: most people would have taken the easy path. Della looked at the rows. The Blue Clarage stood the way it always stood, patient, specific, indifferent to the purposes people assigned to it, concerned only with the business of growing. The easy path, she said, goes somewhere else. The piece ran on a Sunday morning in the last week of August, the Sunday of Labor Day weekend, when the Blue Clarage was at full dent and the Tamworths were fat in their summer pasture and the jars in the root cellar were waiting for November. The headline, which Della had not been shown in advance, read, "They laughed when she refused the Monsanto contract," until her heirloom corn made the front page. She read those words sitting at the pine table with her coffee, and something moved through her that she would not name for a long time. Later she would call it recognition, the feeling of seeing yourself placed in a story that is true but larger than you remembered living. The photograph that ran at the top of the piece was the one Marcus Webb's photographer had taken in the root cellar. The single bare bulb. The shelves of jars in their rows. Della standing with her hand resting on the second shelf, not posing, looking at the nearest jar with the same expression she always wore in that space, quiet, attending, as if listening to something. On the second shelf, just visible in the photograph, was the jar in older handwriting, BC, 1971. She had not asked them to include it. They had simply photographed what was there. The calls began before she finished her coffee. The seed-saving community called, people from Ohio, from Virginia, from upstate New York, from Oregon. A grain cooperative in the Willamette Valley called to ask about sourcing. A chef in Nashville called, and then a chef in Atlanta, and then someone from a food publication in New York City who had a voice like a person who had never been east of the Appalachians and wanted to be. Harold Sprouse called. He said, simply, "Della. I wanted to say." He did not finish the sentence. She let the silence sit. "I know, Harold," she said. Ruth Hensley called and said the journal article had received more download requests in the 48 hours since the newspaper piece than in the previous 3 months combined. She said 3 universities had reached out about partnership programs. She said the Fort Collins germplasm repository had formally upgraded the status of Della's Blue Clarage sample to the highest preservation priority tier. Cecilia Park did not call. She drove up the gravel lane on Monday morning with 3 pastries wrapped in paper and a pot of coffee in a thermos, and she sat at the pine table across from Della and they ate and drank coffee and said almost nothing, and that was the right thing. But the thing that stayed with Della, the thing she thought about in the days after, walking the rows at dusk as the blue CLA